in the shadow of Utah's red rock cliffs, where the Blackwater River runs orange with decades of mining poison, there once stood an orchard that defied nature itself. While the valley withered and miners coughed blood into their respirators, the Willard family's apple trees bore fruit so red it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Travelers spoke in whispers of the family's strange immunity to the wasting sickness that claimed every other soul in that cursed canyon. But immunity, they would learn, came with a price that history tried desperately to drown. What no one suspected was that the Willards had discovered a recipe, passed down through generations of selective breeding and sanctified by twisted scripture, a recipe that required the most tender of ingredients. Deathbed confessions would later speak of children who vanished from the family's nursery, declared unclean by standards known only to the patriarch. Neighbors whispered of midnight sounds from the root cellar, of strange preservation techniques that went far beyond apple jam. The most disturbing rumors suggested that the family's legendary fertility, both of their bloodline and their land, came from a source that violated every law of God and man. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. But it was only when a disgraced son fled with a leather-bound ledger that investigators began to understand the horrifying mathematics of survival in Blackwater Valley. What they discovered was not just murder, not just cannibalism, but a systematic eugenics program where the imperfect became sustenance for those deemed worthy of the pure bloodline. This was not just crime, this was a feast that sustained a dynasty for 40 years. To understand how a family could become predators, you must first understand the trap that made them possible. Blackwater Valley was nature's own experiment in isolation and desperation, a box canyon carved deep into the Utah highlands, where the sun disappeared behind towering red cliffs by 3 in the afternoon. The valley stretched barely 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, its only entrance a narrow gap that miners called the Throat for good reason. The Blackwater River earned its name not from any natural darkness, but from 4 decades of silver mining runoff that turned its waters the color of old blood. Selenium, mercury, and arsenic leached from the mountain's wounds, creating a cocktail of poison that made the very air taste of metal. The river was the valley's lifeline and its curse, the only source of water for hundreds of miles in any direction. By the time the Willards arrived in 1872, Blackwater was already a graveyard with a mining operation built on top. The Blackwater cough had earned its reputation as the valley's true landlord, claiming every miner within a decade of his first shift underground. Men would arrive strong and leave in pine boxes, their lungs turned to leather by the poisoned dust that hung in the air like a permanent fog. The Willard claim sat at the valley's narrow mouth, where a natural spring bubbled up from deep underground, the only source of clean water for 50 miles. Ephraim Willard, the family patriarch, had arrived with his pregnant wife Prudence and a deed that seemed too good to be true. While other families struggled with the basics of survival, the Willards built their compound on the one patch of land that promised life instead of death. What made their situation truly extraordinary was not just their access to clean water, but their complete immunity to the wasting sickness that killed everyone else. Miners who had worked the valley for months would hack up blood and collapse from exhaustion, but the Willard family seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their children were born healthy and stayed healthy, their livestock thrived, and their orchard produced fruit that seemed to glow with its own vitality. The townspeople of Blackwater, desperate and dying, came to view the Willards not as neighbors, but as saviors. Here was a family that had solved the riddle of survival in a place where survival seemed impossible. The Willards became the valley's unofficial nobility, their word carrying the weight of life and death. When Ephraim Willard spoke about divine favor and genetic purity, people listened with the desperation of the drowning. But isolation breeds more than just dependency. In a place where the outside world might as well not exist, where the nearest law enforcement was a 3-day ride through mountain passes that closed half the year, normal rules began to bend and break. The Willards understood something that would take investigators decades to piece together. When you control the only clean water and the only healthy bloodline in a dying valley, you don't just hold power over people's bodies. You hold dominion over their souls. What seemed like divine protection hid an appetite that defied nature. Ephraim Willard stood 6 feet 4 inches in his bare feet, a towering patriarch whose presence commanded silence in any room he entered. His beard, streaked with premature white despite his 40 years, framed a face that could quote scripture with the authority of Moses and justify atrocity with the calm logic of a merchant tallying profits. Those who knew him described a man who spoke softly and carried himself with the dignity of ordained royalty, never raising his voice because he never needed to. When Ephraim Willard decided something was God's will, it became law in Blackwater Valley. His wife Prudence was his perfect complement, a woman of 35 who had borne him 7 children and buried 3 with the same serene expression. She moved through their compound like a ghost-made flesh, her hands perpetually stained with soil from the gardens or the deep red of preserves from the kitchen. Neighbors noted that Prudence never seemed to wash these stains completely away, as if the earth and its bounty had become part of her very skin. She spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, but her silence carried more weight than most people's sermons. The Willard compound sat like a fortress of normalcy against the valley's decay. The main house was a 2-story Victorian structure painted white as bone, its gingerbread trim maintained despite the harsh mountain winters. A wraparound porch offered views of the impossibly green orchard that stretched behind the house, row upon row of apple trees that bore fruit even when the seasons said they shouldn't. To the casual observer, it looked like prosperity incarnate, a testament to hard work and divine favor. But the compound held secrets in its architecture. Behind the main house stood a smaller building that the family called the nursery, though it seemed strangely isolated from the main residence. This structure featured no windows on its rear wall, and only a single door secured with a heavy iron bolt that could only be opened from the outside. When curious neighbors asked about the building's purpose, Ephraim would explain that some of their children were born delicate and required special care away from the bustling household. The root cellar beneath the main house told its own story to those who knew how to read the signs. Far larger than necessary for a family's winter stores, it featured stone walls that stayed cold even in summer and drainage channels that seemed engineered for more than preserving vegetables. The cellar's heavy wooden door remained locked year-round, and Prudence kept the only key on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her high-collared dresses. Of the Willard children who survived to adulthood, young Caleb occupied a precarious position. Born with a slight limp from a childhood injury, he lived in constant fear that his imperfection might one day draw his father's calculating gaze. At 17, Caleb had learned to walk without favoring his weak leg, to hide any sign of the flaw that made him different from his flawless siblings. He watched his parents with the desperate attention of prey studying predators, noting every gesture, every meaningful glance that passed between them. The family's daily routines revolved around rituals that outsiders mistook for simple devotion. Morning prayers lasted exactly 30 minutes, with Ephraim reading from scriptures about bloodlines and chosen people. Evening meals began with elaborate blessings over their food, particularly when they served the preserves that Prudence prepared in her locked cellar. The children were taught to recite genealogies stretching back generations, emphasizing purity of bloodline and divine selection. What made the Willards truly terrifying was not their fanaticism, but their absolute conviction in their righteousness. They genuinely believed that their genetic superiority came with both privilege and responsibility. When Ephraim spoke of culling the imperfect, he did so with the same moral certainty that other fathers used to discuss protecting their children from harm. The family had convinced themselves that their actions served a higher purpose, that their sacrifices fed not just their orchard, but their covenant with God Himself. The townspeople of Blackwater observed the Willards with a mixture of gratitude and superstitious dread. They brought their sick children to Prudence, who would examine them with gentle hands and knowing eyes before dispensing remedies from her private stores. They sought Ephraim's counsel on matters of faith and survival, hanging on every word as if their lives depended on his approval, which in many ways they did. For years, the system held perfect silence until the first birth that couldn't be hidden. The winter of 1885 brought bitter cold to Blackwater Valley, freezing even the Willard spring solid. During this harsh season, Prudence Willard went into labor with her 8th child, requiring the services of Mary Hutchins, the valley's only midwife who had delivered half the children in Blackwater. Mary had attended 4 previous Willard births, each producing infants of remarkable health and beauty. She arrived with quiet confidence, expecting another textbook delivery. What she found in the birthing room would rob her of speech forever. The child was born alive but marked with what frontier medicine called a devil's thumbprint, a port wine birthmark covering half his tiny face, in deep crimson. The mark stretched from temple to jaw, impossible to hide. In most families, such a birthmark would bring momentary concern followed by acceptance. In the Willard household, it was received with silence that felt like the drawing of a blade. Mary later wrote to her sister about Ephraim Willard's first glimpse of his marked son. The patriarch showed no emotion, examining the child like livestock that had failed specifications. He did not hold the infant, offer comfort to his wife, or acknowledge new life. He simply nodded once to Prudence and left without a word. What troubled Mary most was Prudence's complete lack of reaction. The woman who had wept joy over previous children received this marked infant with the same serene expression she wore while preserving fruit. She cleaned the child mechanically, swaddled him, and placed him in a cradle positioned unusually far from the bed. Mary was instructed to stay overnight, but found herself disturbed by unnatural quiet. No relatives visited, no neighbors congratulated, no celebration echoed from the house. It was as if the birth had never occurred. During early morning hours, Mary witnessed Ephraim carrying a small bundle toward the isolated nursery building. He carried it with casual indifference, unlocked the door, disappeared inside for minutes, and emerged carrying nothing. Mary watched in growing horror from her frost-covered window. 7 days later, the Blackwater Prospector ran a brief obituary for the unnamed Willard infant, citing failure to thrive. No funeral services, no burial details, no expressions of grief. When neighbors inquired about condolences, Ephraim explained the family preferred private mourning according to religious customs, but Mary knew what she had seen. She began asking careful questions, wondering why no crying came from the nursery, why no tiny grave appeared, why Prudence recovered with unseemly speed. Her inquiries caught attention of young miner Thomas Walsh, who mentioned seeing Ephraim working the orchard at unusual hours by lantern light, often with a shovel. Thomas Walsh's curiosity proved fatal. 3 days after sharing observations with Mary, he was found crushed in a mine cave-in in a previously stable section. The investigation concluded he violated safety protocols by working alone, ignoring that no Blackwater miner ever worked without a partner. His death was recorded as accidental, his body buried quickly, Mary Hutchins never spoke again after Thomas Walsh's funeral. Neighbors found her alive but silent, her voice stolen by shock or fear. She communicated only through incoherent gestures and notes. The gossipy woman spent remaining years in absolute silence, as if speaking truth would summon consequences too terrible to contemplate. The incident was buried beneath willful ignorance, but fear took root. Parents held newborns tighter. Minors avoided working alone, and everyone developed unspoken understanding that some questions were too dangerous to ask. The Willards had demonstrated their definition of family extended only to those meeting exacting standards of perfection. The incident planted seeds of fear, but the Willards didn't just bury their mistakes. What investigators would later piece together from Ephraim's coded ledger was not random violence, but a systematic operation refined over decades. The Willards had created what could only be described as a human processing facility, disguised as a loving family devoted to genetic purity. Every birth, every death, every ritual feast followed predetermined steps designed to maintain their twisted covenant with what they believed was divine will. The assessment began within hours of each birth. Ephraim and Prudence would examine every newborn with the methodical precision of livestock inspectors, searching for imperfections that violated their standards of genetic purity. A cleft palate, an extra toe, a birthmark, a slightly misshapen ear, any deviation from their ideal of physical perfection marked the child for what the family euphemistically called divine recall. The examination was conducted in absolute silence, with the parents treating the infant like a specimen rather than their offspring. Children who passed this initial inspection were welcomed into the family with celebration and ceremony. Those who failed simply disappeared. The culling process moved with practiced efficiency. Honed through years of experience, the marked child would be taken to the isolated nursery building where Prudence maintained what she called her special nursery for delicate infants. The building's windowless design and external bolt system ensured complete privacy for whatever took place inside. What happened in that nursery remained one of the family's most guarded secrets, until Caleb's eventual testimony provided horrifying details. The selected children were not killed quickly or mercifully. Instead, they were kept alive for specific periods, fed carefully measured diets, and subjected to what Ephraim described in his ledger as preparation rituals. The timing of these preparations always coincided with the approach of the summer and winter solstices, when the family held their most sacred feasts. The ritual itself took place in the root cellar beneath the main house. Transformed for these occasions into what Ephraim called their communion chamber. The massive stone-walled space featured a preparation area with specialized tools, drainage channels carved into the floor, and preservation equipment that went far beyond typical food storage needs. The family would gather for what they genuinely believed was a sacrament, consuming specially prepared dishes that Prudence created from ingredients no cookbook would ever list. Reverend Amos Thorne's role in sanctifying these rituals cannot be understated. His sermon notes reveal a man who had convinced himself that the family's cannibalistic practices represented a higher form of Christian communion. He would arrive at the compound before each solstice feast, Bible in hand, ready to bless what he described as the consumption of the impure to strengthen the pure. His theological justifications drew heavily from Scripture about eating the flesh of the righteous, twisted into blasphemous permission for unspeakable acts. The town's complicity in this system extended far beyond willful ignorance. Sheriff John Hale's private journals reveal that he received regular payments from the Willards in exchange for asking no questions about missing children or mysterious deaths. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Hayes, routinely filed false death certificates, citing natural causes for deaths he never investigated. Even the local undertaker, Marcus Reed, participated by providing empty coffins for burial services of children whose bodies were never recovered. The cycle completed itself through the family's orchard, which served as both graveyard and garden. The processed remains of the consumed children were carefully composted with lime and ash before being worked into the soil around the apple trees. This horrific fertilization process explained the orchard's supernatural fertility in an otherwise poisoned valley. The trees that produced the family's famous preserves literally grew from the bones of murdered children. What made the system truly diabolical was its self-perpetuating nature. The enhanced fertility of the orchard provided the family with valuable trade goods that strengthened their economic position in the valley. The regular feasts convinced them of their own divine favor and genetic superiority. The complicity of town officials ensured that their crimes would never face official investigation. Each successful cycle reinforced their belief that they were chosen people carrying out God's will. The psychological conditioning of the surviving Willard children represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. Children like Caleb were raised from infancy to view the culling of imperfect siblings as natural and necessary. They learned to celebrate the disappearance of marked babies, to participate in the preparation of ritual meals, and to never question the source of their family's prosperity. The normalization of horror began in earliest childhood. The machine was efficient, silent, and sanctified. But every machine has a breaking point. For the Willards, it had a name: Caleb. Caleb Willard had lived 17 years in the shadow of his own imperfection, a slight limp from a childhood fall that made him acutely aware of how thin the line was between acceptance and elimination in his family. Unlike his siblings, who had been born into the system's horror with the innocence of complete indoctrination, Caleb possessed the dangerous combination of insider knowledge and outsider perspective that comes from walking the razor's edge of survival. The breaking point came during the winter solstice feast of 1911, when Caleb witnessed something that shattered his carefully constructed psychological defenses. His youngest sister had given birth to twins, one perfect and one born with a withered arm. Caleb watched his father examine the imperfect infant with the same calculating gaze he had seen turned on livestock, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what he was seeing. This was not divine will. This was murder with a theological mask. What horrified Caleb most was not just his family's actions, but his own complicity in them. He realized that he had participated in ritual feasts for years, consuming what his parents called blessed sustenance while praising the enhanced fertility it brought to both family and orchard. The revelation that he had been cannibalizing his own siblings sent him into a psychological spiral that manifested as violent nightmares and constant paranoia about his own safety. His paranoia proved justified when he overheard a conversation between his parents about the growing attention their family was receiving from outsiders. A Pinkerton agent had arrived in Blackwater asking questions about missing persons, and Ephraim was discussing the need to cleanse the valley of potentially dangerous witnesses. The casual way his father spoke about murdering the investigator made Caleb realize that the family's violence extended far beyond their eugenic practices. If you're finding this as disturbing as I am, subscribe so you don't miss when we uncover what history tried to bury forever. The decision to steal his father's ledger came to Caleb during a moment of desperate clarity. He knew that without concrete evidence, no one would believe the fantastic allegations he planned to make. More importantly, he understood that the ledger contained not just records of the family's crimes, but proof of the town's complicity in covering them up. The leather-bound book represented both his death warrant and his only hope for survival. The theft required weeks of careful planning and observation. Caleb studied his father's routines, noting that Ephraim kept the ledger locked in a strongbox in his private study, but removed it every evening to make entries by lamplight. The key hung on a chain around his father's neck during the day, but was placed on the bedside table each night. Caleb would have one opportunity, and failure would mean joining his imperfect siblings in the root cellar. On the night of February 14, 1912, Caleb made his move. He waited until the household had settled into deep sleep, then crept into his parents' bedroom with hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the key. The sound of his father's breathing seemed impossibly loud as he carefully lifted the metal chain and slipped it over Ephraim's head. The few minutes it took to unlock the strongbox and remove the ledger felt like hours of pure terror. The ledger's contents exceeded even Caleb's worst fears. Page after page documented not just the family's eugenic murders, but a systematic operation involving dozens of missing minors, traveling merchants, and anyone else who had asked inconvenient questions about the Willards' activities. The coded entries revealed payments to town officials, schedules for ritual feasts, and detailed records of which body parts were used for which purposes in both consumption and fertilization. Getting the evidence to the Pinkerton agent required an intermediary that Caleb found in Lena Hartwell, a 15-year-old girl who worked in the Willard orchard and had witnessed enough strange activities to suspect the family's true nature. Lena's heterochromatic eyes, one blue and one brown, should have marked her for elimination under normal circumstances, but the family's need for orchard workers had granted her a temporary reprieve from their eugenic standards. The clandestine meeting took place at the old mine elevator shaft, a location chosen for its acoustic properties that would allow them to hear anyone approaching. Caleb arrived first, clutching the stolen ledger and fighting waves of nausea at what he was about to reveal. When Agent Elijah Frost appeared through the pre-dawn darkness, Caleb handed over not just evidence of his family's crimes, but a complete map of institutional corruption that extended throughout Blackwater Valley. With testimony and evidence promised, justice seemed possible. But in Blackwater, law was just another family branch. The chain of events that would eventually expose the Willards began with a young miner named Thomas Reed, who arrived in Blackwater Valley during the autumn of 1911 with the kind of persistent curiosity that proved fatal in a town built on secrets. Reed came from Pennsylvania coal country, where miners had learned to ask hard questions about working conditions and mysterious deaths. His mistake was bringing those same questions to a place where curiosity was considered a terminal illness. Reed distinguished himself almost immediately by refusing to accept the standard explanations for Blackwater's peculiar mortality patterns. While other miners accepted that the Blackwater cough claimed lives with supernatural efficiency, Reed began documenting the timeline of deaths and noticed disturbing inconsistencies. Men who had worked the mines for years would suddenly vanish, their belongings removed and their debts mysteriously settled by unknown benefactors. The official explanation was always the same. They had absconded in shame after borrowing money they couldn't repay. What made Reed particularly dangerous to the established order was his systematic approach to investigation. He began keeping detailed records of missing miners, cross-referencing their disappearances with unusual activities around the Willard compound. His notes, later recovered by investigators, showed a man who had identified patterns that no one in Blackwater wanted acknowledged. Reed documented late-night movements between the Willard property and the mine entrance, unexplained increases in orchard productivity following worker disappearances, and the family's suspicious immunity to diseases that killed everyone else. The fatal mistake came when Reed began sharing his observations with other miners, suggesting they organized to demand answers about their missing colleagues. In a community where survival depended on not asking questions, Reed's activism represented an existential threat to the delicate balance of fear and complicity that kept the Willards' operation functioning. His passionate speeches about worker rights and safety investigations attracted audiences but also drew the attention of those who had the most to lose from honest inquiries. Reed's disappearance followed the same pattern as dozens before him, but this time someone cared enough to investigate. His sister Margaret, a schoolteacher in Pittsburgh, had been receiving regular letters from her brother detailing his concerns about conditions in Blackwater. When the letters stopped abruptly in November of 1911, she waited 2 weeks before contacting the local sheriff. When Sheriff Hale's response dismissed her concerns with bureaucratic indifference, Margaret Reed took her savings and hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Agent Elijah Frost represented everything that Blackwater Valley feared most: an outsider with authority, resources, and no stake in maintaining the status quo. A veteran investigator in his 40s, Frost had built his reputation on cases involving missing persons and corporate malfeasance. His immaculate appearance, methodical approach, and an obvious education marked him as foreign to a community that had learned to distrust anyone who didn't bear the physical marks of hard labor and environmental poisoning. Frost's arrival in December of 1911 created immediate tension throughout the valley. His clean clothes and healthy complexion stood in stark contrast to the pallor and persistent coughing that marked longtime residents. More disturbing to the locals was his habit of asking direct questions and expecting honest answers, a communication style that violated every unspoken rule of Blackwater society. When Frost inquired about Thomas Reed's last known activities, he was met with the kind of coordinated silence that only comes from community-wide conspiracy. The investigators' first interviews revealed the depth of institutional corruption that protected the Willards. Sheriff Hale claimed that Reed had mentioned plans to leave town suddenly due to gambling debts. The mine foreman insisted that Reed had been dismissed for insubordination and drunkenness. The boarding house owner stated that Reed had packed his belongings in the middle of the night and left money to settle his account. Every official story contradicted the others, but all reached the same conclusion. Thomas Reed had left Blackwater voluntarily. Frost's trained eye recognized the hallmarks of a coordinated cover-up, but he also understood that breaking through the wall of silence would require finding someone willing to talk. His opportunity came through an unexpected source: Lena Hartwell, the young woman who worked in the Willard orchard and possessed the kind of observational skills that come from living on the margins of a dangerous situation. Her heterochromatic eyes seemed to notice everything, and her precarious position between the family's favor and suspicion made her uniquely motivated to seek outside protection. The tentative connection between Frost and Lena developed through careful observation and subtle signals. She began leaving small signs of her presence during his visits to the orchard, arranging fallen apples in patterns that suggested human intention rather than natural occurrence. When Frost finally approached her directly, Lena's response was immediate and terrifying. She pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand and whispered a single word: "Midnight." Frost knew he was being lied to, but he didn't know the entire town was the lie. The confrontation came to a head on March 3, 1912, when Agent Frost marched into Sheriff Hale's office, carrying evidence that should have justified searching the Willard compound. The stolen ledger pages from Caleb, combined with Lena Hartwell's eyewitness testimony, painted a picture of systematic murder that demanded immediate investigation. Sheriff Hale received Frost's evidence with weary resignation, his hands shaking not from shock at the contents, but from fear of refusing to cooperate with a federal investigator. The coded references to culling and Harvest cycles were damning, with dates matching disappearances that Hale had helped cover up for years. What Frost didn't realize was that his demand had triggered a well-rehearsed emergency protocol. While the sheriff pretended to study the evidence, his deputy slipped out the back door with instructions to warn the Willards. The warning system that had protected the family for decades faced its most serious challenge yet. The search party assembled at the sheriff's office represented a compromise satisfying no one but providing legal cover for all involved. Sheriff Hale insisted on leading the search personally with 2 deputies and a magistrate to witness whatever they found. Frost reluctantly agreed, understanding he had no choice but to work within the corrupt local system. The ride to the compound took place in tense silence, each member lost in thoughts about what they might discover. Frost checked his pistol and reviewed mental notes about the layout, while Hale prayed the warning had provided enough time for the Willards to eliminate incriminating evidence. The scene that greeted them was a masterpiece of calculated innocence. Ephraim Willard stood on his porch in Sunday best, Bible in hand, flanked by his wife and children arranged like a portrait of frontier piety. The patriarch's calm demeanor suggested a man with nothing to hide, while his family's coordinated presentation spoke to years of practice managing unwelcome scrutiny. Prudence Willard's performance was, perhaps, most disturbing. She moved through the search with serene grace, offering investigators fresh cider and homemade biscuits, while they ransacked her home, looking for evidence of cannibalistic murder. Her hands, described by Caleb as perpetually stained, were now immaculately clean, showing no trace of gruesome work performed hours earlier. The nursery building had been transformed into an innocent storage facility filled with farming equipment and preserved goods. The external bolt securing the door was gone. Fresh whitewash covered any stains, and strategically placed dried herbs masked lingering odors of death and decay. The root cellar search proved equally frustrating. What had been described as a communion chamber with specialized tools and drainage systems appeared to be nothing more than an oversized food storage area. The stone walls showed no modifications for disposing of human remains, and the equipment Caleb described was nowhere to be found. Most devastating was the complete absence of human remains, or forensic evidence supporting allegations of systematic murder and cannibalism. Frost expected bone fragments, bloodstains, or preserved body parts providing irrefutable proof. Instead, he discovered only normal farm detritus, root vegetables, preserved meats, and implements belonging to any frontier family. The search's failure transformed Ephraim from defensive suspect to righteous victim within hours. Standing in his ransacked home, the patriarch delivered a performance combining wounded dignity with Christian forgiveness that made Frost appear the aggressor. His calm recitation of biblical verses about persecution resonated with reluctant local officials. When the search party prepared to leave, Ephraim's parting words carried quiet menace that had kept Blackwater Valley in line for decades. Speaking with gentle correction, the patriarch suggested the detectives' time might be better spent investigating actual crimes rather than pursuing fantasies inspired by local gossip. Frost had been outmaneuvered by professionals perfecting their deception for 40 years. Without physical evidence, the Willards were legally untouchable and morally vindicated. But in Blackwater, evidence was buried deeper than bones. The stolen ledger that Caleb delivered to Agent Frost in the pre-dawn darkness of the mine shaft represented more than just evidence of the Willard family's crimes. It was a mathematical proof of systematic murder spanning 4 decades, written in Ephraim's own meticulous handwriting and encoded in language that transformed horror into bookkeeping entries. What Frost discovered as he decoded the pages by lamplight would haunt him for the rest of his life. The ledger's coding system was elegantly simple. designed to hide atrocity behind agricultural terminology that would appear innocent to casual observers. Culling referred to the elimination of imperfect children with specific notations indicating the nature of each child's defect. Harvest marked the dates of ritual consumption, always coinciding with solstice celebrations. Yield tracked the orchard's productivity following each feeding, creating a grotesque correlation between murder and agricultural success that spanned generations. Frost's methodical cross-referencing revealed patterns that no coincidence could explain. Every entry marked culling was followed within days by a harvest notation, which was invariably followed by dramatic increases in yield measurements. The mathematical relationship between child murder and orchard fertility was so consistent that Frost could predict seasonal productivity based solely on the frequency of family killings. The scope of the operation became clear as Frost worked through decades of entries. The ledger documented not just the elimination of imperfect Willard children, but the systematic murder of anyone who posed a threat to the family's operation. Miners who asked too many questions were listed under equipment failures, with their disappearances coinciding with convenient cave-ins or industrial accidents. Traveling merchants who witnessed suspicious activities were recorded as inventory losses, their wagons and goods absorbed into the family's growing wealth. Most damning of all were the financial entries that revealed the town's complicity in the Willards' crimes. Regular payments to Sheriff Hale were disguised as security services, while bribes to the coroner appeared as medical consultations. The local preacher's theological justifications for cannibalism were compensated through religious donations, and even the undertaker received burial preparations payments for providing empty coffins during fake funeral services. The ledger's most horrifying section detailed the processing and preservation techniques that the family had perfected over decades of practice. Ephraim recorded which cuts of meat provided the best flavor, which preparation methods maximized nutritional value, and which preservation techniques allowed for long-term storage of human remains. The clinical detachment of these entries revealed a family that had completely dehumanized their victims, reducing children to nothing more than a renewable resource. Frost's analysis revealed that the Willards had murdered at least 67 people over 4 decades, including 31 family members deemed genetically imperfect, and 36 outsiders who had threatened their operation. The numbers far exceeded the official death records maintained by the town, creating a mathematical impossibility that could only be explained by systematic cover-up involving multiple levels of local government. The economic dimension of the crimes became clear as Frost traced the correlation between murders and the family's growing wealth. Each killing was followed by increased agricultural productivity that translated into higher profits from apple sales, expanded land holdings, and growing political influence throughout the region. The Willards had literally built their prosperity on the bones of their victims, creating a sustainable business model based on systematic murder. What made the ledger truly devastating was its revelation of the family's long-term planning and methodical approach to victim selection. Ephraim had maintained detailed profiles of potential targets, tracking their backgrounds, family connections, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. The patriarch had approached murder with the same careful consideration that other businessmen applied to inventory management. The final entries in the ledger, dating to just weeks before Caleb's theft, revealed the family's awareness that their operation was under threat. Ephraim had begun planning for the elimination of Agent Frost, with detailed notes about the investigators' daily routines and strategies for staging another accidental death that would remove the external threat to their continued operation. As Frost completed his analysis of the ledger's contents, He understood that he held mathematical proof of systematic murder that spanned generations. The numbers told a story that no amount of theatrical innocence could refute, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence linking the Willards to decades of unsolved disappearances and unexplained deaths throughout Blackwater Valley. The numbers revealed systematic murder spanning generations. But before arrests could be made, the valley itself rose to protect its secret. The mob that gathered outside Agent Frost's boarding house on the night of March 15, 1912, represented the final transformation of Blackwater Valley from reluctant accomplices to active participants in protecting the Willards' operation. What had begun as willful ignorance and passive complicity had evolved into something far more dangerous. A community united in the belief that their survival depended on silencing the truth forever. Sheriff Hale led the crowd of nearly 40 men, their faces illuminated by torchlight that cast dancing shadows across features twisted by fear and desperation. These were not the faces of evil men, but of cornered animals who understood that exposure of the Willards' crimes would reveal their own complicity in decades of cover-ups. The miners who had once whispered questions about missing colleagues now carried pickaxes and demanded silence from the investigator who threatened their precarious existence. The crowd's composition revealed the depth of institutional corruption that had enabled the Willards' operation for so long. Town council members stood alongside mine supervisors, while the local doctor and undertaker flanked the corrupt sheriff. Even Reverend Thorne had emerged from his church to join the mob, his Bible conspicuously absent as he helped orchestrate what could only be described as a lynching party disguised as concerned citizenship. Frost had anticipated trouble, but the scale of the community's response caught him off guard. From his second-floor window, he could see that every adult male in Blackwater had joined the mob, their unified purpose suggesting coordination that went far beyond spontaneous anger. This was not a riot, but a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate the external threat to their way of life once and for all. The crowd's demands were delivered through Sheriff Hale's trembling voice, though his words carried the authority of collective desperation rather than legal jurisdiction. They wanted Caleb Willard handed over for his own protection, they claimed, along with the stolen ledger that contained nothing but the fantasies of a disturbed young man seeking revenge against his loving family. The transparency of their lies was less important than the implicit threat behind them. When Frost refused to comply, the mob's veneer of legal authority collapsed entirely. Someone threw the first stone through his window, and the sound of breaking glass triggered a cascade of violence that had been building for months. The boarding house door splintered under the impact of a mining sledge, and suddenly the narrow stairway filled with the sound of boots and angry voices demanding justice for their town's reputation. Frost had prepared for this moment by memorizing the layout of the building and identifying multiple escape routes. As the mob surged up the stairs, he was already moving through a back window onto the roof of an adjacent building. The stolen ledger was secured in a waterproof satchel across his chest, while his service revolver provided minimal comfort against overwhelming odds. The chase that followed transformed the quiet mining town into a battleground of shadows and echoing gunshots. Frost moved through back alleys and over rooftops, while the mob spread out to cut off his escape routes, their torches creating a moving constellation of light that tracked his progress through the darkness. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood marked their systematic search of every building that might provide shelter. Caleb Willard had been hiding in an abandoned mine shaft when the violence began, but the sound of gunshots and shouting drew him toward the town center against his better judgment. What he witnessed was the complete moral collapse of the community he had grown up in, as neighbors and friends transformed into a hunting pack determined to preserve their complicity through murder. The convergence of Frost and Caleb at the main mine entrance was both coincidental and inevitable. Two desperate men seeking the only refuge that offered protection from the mob's torches and weapons. The mine's labyrinthine tunnels provided temporary safety, but also created the perfect trap for anyone foolish enough to pursue them into the underground darkness, where cave-ins and toxic gases claimed lives with regularity. The mob's pursuit into the mine marked the point where fear overcame reason entirely. Men who understood the dangers of underground work better than anyone else willingly followed their quarry into passages that had been abandoned due to structural instability. The sound of their voices echoed through tunnels that had claimed dozens of lives over the decades, creating an eerie soundtrack to the valley's final act of self-destruction. In the crushing darkness of the deepest shafts, Frost and Caleb became separated. The investigator's shouts for his informant were answered only by the distant echoes of the pursuing mob and the ominous creaking of timber supports that had been weakened by years of neglect. The mine that had built Blackwater Valley's economy was about to become its graveyard. Dawn broke on a town that no longer recognized itself. Agent Frost emerged from the mine alone, his clothes torn and his face marked by underground hazards, clutching the ledger that had cost so many lives to obtain. Behind him, the main shaft had collapsed during the night's violence, sealing the tunnels and trapping several members of the mob in a tomb of their own making. Dawn broke on a town Frost wouldn't recognize. Caleb was gone, and the Willards had vanished with him. What Agent Frost discovered in the abandoned Willard compound on the morning of March 16th would forever change his understanding of the case he thought he had solved. The family had indeed vanished, but the systematic destruction of evidence revealed a level of organization that went far beyond what any single household could accomplish. This was not just a family secret that had been exposed, but a community conspiracy that was actively covering its tracks. The ransacked state of the main house told a story of desperate efficiency. Every piece of furniture had been overturned, every drawer emptied, every hiding place searched by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. But this was not the random vandalism of an angry mob. Someone had methodically removed specific items while leaving others untouched, suggesting intimate knowledge of what evidence existed and where it might be hidden. Frost's most shocking discovery came in the form of a hidden safe behind a false wall in Ephraim's study. Blown open with mining explosives and completely emptied, the safe's contents had clearly been substantial, based on the metal filing system that remained behind. But scattered around the empty vault were fragments of documents that the destroyers had missed in their haste, including portions of what appeared to be a community ledger that dwarfed even Ephraim's personal records. The surviving fragments revealed entries dating back to the town's founding, written in multiple handwritings and documenting payments that flowed in both directions between the Willards and virtually every business in Blackwater Valley. The family had not been operating in isolation, but as the cornerstone of an economic system that distributed the profits from their crimes throughout the entire community. Every merchant, every official, every property owner had received regular payments disguised as legitimate business transactions. What made the discovery truly devastating was the realization that the town's complicity was not based on fear or coercion, but on calculated self-interest. The fragments showed that Blackwater's unusual prosperity in an otherwise failing mining region was directly subsidized by the Willard operation. The family's crimes had not been tolerated despite their horror, but because of their profitability. Every resident had been receiving blood money for decades, without questioning its source. Frost found additional evidence in the form of architectural modifications throughout the compound that could never have been completed without community assistance. The root cellar's drainage system connected to underground channels that led directly to the mine's water management system, allowing for the disposal of evidence on an industrial scale. The nursery building's soundproofing had been installed by the same carpenters who had worked on the church and schoolhouse, using materials that appeared in multiple construction projects throughout the town. The orchard itself told the most damning story of all. Soil samples that Frost collected revealed mineral concentrations that could only have come from human remains, but the quantities suggested far more bodies than even the inflated numbers in Ephraim's ledger. Cross-referencing with missing person reports from surrounding counties revealed a pattern of disappearances that stretched across 3 states and involved dozens of unsolved cases dating back decades. The scope of the operation became clear when Frost discovered correspondence between Ephraim Willard and similar families in other isolated communities throughout the Mountain West. The letters, hidden in a cavity beneath the floorboards, revealed a network of eugenics practitioners who shared techniques, traded victims, and coordinated their activities to avoid detection by federal authorities. The Willards were not unique monsters, but part of a larger movement that used geographic isolation and community complicity to pursue their twisted ideology. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the town's religious justifications for the Willards' crimes had been carefully developed over years of theological manipulation. Reverend Thorne's private correspondence revealed coordination with other corrupt clergymen who had developed sophisticated scriptural arguments for cannibalism and eugenics. The community's moral framework had been deliberately perverted to normalize atrocity and transform murder into a form of divine service. The final piece of evidence came in the form of detailed evacuation plans that had been distributed to every household in Blackwater Valley weeks before Frost's arrival. The community had been preparing for the possibility of exposure for months, with predetermined roles for evidence destruction, witness elimination, and coordinated escape routes that would scatter the population across multiple states and territories. Frost realized that his investigation had not uncovered a family of murderers protected by a frightened community, but a town of willing accomplices who had spent 40 years profiting from systematic slaughter. The mob that had attacked him was not trying to protect the Willards, but to protect themselves from the consequences of their own complicity. Every person in Blackwater Valley was guilty of conspiracy to commit murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The family was the engine, but the town was the fuel. To erase the evidence, they had to erase the map. The solution that Blackwater Valley's town council implemented in the weeks following Agent Frost's investigation was as ruthless as it was comprehensive. Rather than face the legal consequences of their decades-long complicity in mass murder, the community's leaders chose to erase both the evidence and themselves from the historical record through an act of deliberate environmental destruction that would be remembered as a tragic natural disaster. The plan had been discussed in hushed conversations for months before Frost's arrival, but the investigators' discoveries forced the timeline into desperate acceleration. Sheriff Hale, acting on instructions from the emergency town council meeting held in the abandoned mine office, coordinated with the remaining mining engineers to identify the canyon wall's structural weaknesses that could be exploited to trigger a catastrophic flood. The engineering required for such destruction was beyond the capabilities of the remaining residents, but Blackwater Valley had attracted exactly the kind of men who understood explosives, hydraulics, and geological formations. The same expertise that had extracted silver from the mountains for decades could be turned toward erasing the very landscape that had sheltered their crimes. What they planned was nothing less than the murder of geography itself. On April 2, 1913, a series of carefully coordinated explosions brought down the canyon walls that had confined the Blackwater River for millennia. The charges were placed with scientific precision, designed to create a cascade failure that would appear to result from natural geological instability rather than human intervention. The sound of the explosions echoed through the mountains for miles, but by then, most of the valley's residents had already fled to predetermined locations across multiple states. The flood that followed was immediate and total. The backed-up river created a lake that submerged not just the Willard compound and the town center, but the mine entrances, the cemetery, and every structure that might have contained evidence of the community's crimes. Within hours, 40 years of systematic murder had disappeared beneath hundreds of feet of mountain water that would take decades to drain naturally. The official investigation into the disaster was led by federal geologists, who found exactly what the town council had intended them to find: evidence of geological instability caused by decades of mining activity that had finally reached a catastrophic tipping point. The report noted unusual selenium concentrations in the water that made the new lake unsuitable for human consumption, effectively ensuring that the area would remain uninhabited for generations to come. Agent Frost's attempts to convince federal authorities that the flood had been deliberately triggered were dismissed as the ravings of a man driven to paranoia by his traumatic experiences in the valley. The Pinkerton Agency, embarrassed by their operatives' failure to solve the missing persons case that had initiated the investigation, quietly transferred Frost to a desk job in Denver and sealed his reports under administrative privilege. His detailed documentation of the Willard family's crimes was filed away as unsubstantiated allegations that died with their accusers. The scattered survivors of Blackwater Valley maintained their conspiracy of silence through carefully coordinated stories about the tragic loss of their community to natural disaster. Those who had received advance warning of the flood claimed to have been visiting relatives or conducting business in distant towns when the canyon walls collapsed. The few who had been caught in the valley during the destruction were officially listed as victims of the geological catastrophe, their deaths serving to reinforce the narrative of unavoidable natural tragedy. The land records that might have revealed the true ownership patterns and financial relationships within Blackwater Valley were conveniently housed in the town hall that now lay beneath 200 feet of contaminated water. The church records that documented births, deaths, and marriages had been stored in the basement of the building that served as Reverend Thorne's residence. Even the mining company's employment records had been kept in offices that were now part of the lake bottom sediment. What remained above water was carefully managed to support the official narrative. The few structures that survived the flood were those located on higher ground and built after the main period of the Willard's operation, creating an archaeological record that suggested a much smaller and more recent settlement than had actually existed. Any artifacts that contradicted this timeline were quietly removed by the survivors during their coordinated salvage operations. The federal government's final report on the Blackwater Valley disaster established the official memory that would persist for generations. The community was described as a small mining settlement of fewer than 100 people who had struggled against environmental hazards and economic hardship before being claimed by the geological instability that plagued many mountain mining operations. There was no mention of the Willard family, no reference to missing persons investigations, and no acknowledgement that the disaster might have been anything other than a tragic accident. The water rose and the story sank, but secrets, like the dead, have ways of resurfacing. The first modern disturbance of Blackwater Valley's enforced silence came during the drought summer of 1973, when the reservoir's water level dropped far enough to expose the skeletal remains of buildings that were not supposed to exist. Hikers exploring the newly revealed shoreline discovered foundations, mining equipment, and personal artifacts that contradicted every official record of the valley's size and population before the 1913 flood. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a perfectly preserved glass jar bearing a handwritten label that read, "Willard Orchard Apple Preserve, 1910. The jar's contents had somehow survived 60 years underwater, their unnaturally deep red color intact despite decades of submersion. When local authorities tested the contents, they found organic compounds that defied easy classification, along with mineral concentrations that suggested the presence of materials that should not have been found in any legitimate food preservation process. The jar's discovery attracted the attention of Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Utah, who had been researching historical mining communities throughout the Mountain West. Her preliminary investigation into Blackwater Valley's official records revealed discrepancies that suggested a much larger settlement than government documents indicated, along with population figures that made no mathematical sense given the community's supposed economic base. Chen's excavations during subsequent low water periods uncovered evidence that fundamentally challenged the accepted history of the valley. Bone fragments found in the sediment showed signs of deliberate processing that was inconsistent with normal burial practices, while soil analysis revealed chemical signatures that indicated the presence of human remains in concentrations far exceeding what any normal cemetery would produce. Most disturbing were the tools and architectural features that suggested systematic food processing on an industrial scale. The academic community's response to Chen's findings was swift and decisive in its rejection. Her initial papers were rejected by major journals. Her funding was quietly withdrawn, and her university colleagues began distancing themselves from research that seemed to rely too heavily on sensational allegations without sufficient empirical support. The official position remained that Blackwater Valley had been a small mining community that had tragically succumbed to geological disaster. But Chen's work had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Urban exploration communities began organizing expeditions to the valley during drought years, when lower water levels allowed access to previously submerged areas. Their discoveries included additional building foundations, mining equipment, and personal artifacts that painted a picture of a much more substantial settlement than official records suggested. More disturbing were the reports of sounds emanating from the deeper, still submerged areas of the site. The Internet age brought new life to the Blackwater Valley mystery. Online forums dedicated to unsolved historical mysteries began collecting testimonies from elderly residents of surrounding communities who remembered stories their grandparents had told about the strange folks who lived in the hidden valley. These second- and third-hand accounts described a community that practiced unusual religious ceremonies and maintained suspicious levels of prosperity despite the region's economic struggles. The legend's most troubling modern manifestation came in the form of isolated religious communities throughout the Mountain West that appeared to be following similar patterns of geographical isolation, genetic insularity, and suspicious mortality rates among children with birth defects. Federal investigators began noticing connections between these groups and historical documents related to the original Blackwater Valley settlement, suggesting that the Willard family's ideology had not died with their community. In 2008, a family compound in rural Montana was raided by federal authorities following reports of missing children and suspicious deaths. The investigation revealed evidence of systematic child abuse, forced intermarriage, and ritualistic practices that bore striking similarities to the allegations that had been made against the Willard family nearly a century earlier. Among the confiscated materials was a hand-copied ledger that used identical coding systems to those found in Ephraim Willard's original records. The most recent development in the Blackwater Valley story came in 2021, when climate change-induced drought reduced the reservoir to its lowest level in recorded history. The exposed lakebed revealed the intact remains of the Willard orchard, with several apple trees still standing despite decades of submersion. Botanists were baffled by the trees' survival, but more disturbing were the soil samples that showed the same unusual mineral concentrations that had been found in the original preserved apple jam. Local law enforcement agencies have noted an uptick in missing persons reports from the area surrounding the former Blackwater Valley, particularly involving individuals who had expressed interest in exploring the exposed ruins. The official position is that these disappearances are consistent with the hazards associated with exploring unstable historical sites, but the pattern of vanishings has attracted the attention of federal investigators who are familiar with the valley's dark history. The water preserved the secret along with the evidence, and the thirst for purity is poison that never fully dilutes. In the end, the truth about the Willard family remains buried beneath deliberate obfuscation, official denial, and time that transforms horrific realities into disputed legend. Without bodies, without living witnesses, without physical evidence surviving the flood, we are left with fragments that suggest monstrous crimes but cannot prove them in court. What we know with certainty is limited but damning. The ledger exists, written in Ephraim's hand and decoded by a federal investigator. Mathematical correlations between coded deaths and agricultural productivity cannot be explained by coincidence. The town's systematic evidence destruction through deliberate flooding represents consciousness of guilt, extending beyond any single family's crimes. We know Blackwater Valley supported a much larger population than official records indicate. The community's prosperity was inconsistent with regional mining output and required external income sources never adequately explained. Dozens of missing persons cases across 3 states point toward the valley as a destination from which travelers never returned. Most significantly, the Willard orchard produced exceptional fruit in soil poisoned by mining runoff. Selenium and mercury concentrations that made the river toxic should have prevented agricultural success, yet their apple trees thrived with supernatural vigor. The only explanation accounting for this biological impossibility is fertilization with materials not found in legitimate agricultural handbooks. The moral dimension extends beyond specific crimes. The Willard story reveals humanity's capacity for rationalization, how communities convince themselves atrocity serves higher purpose, and how economic incentives override moral prohibitions considered absolute and inviolable. If you've stayed with this story to its conclusion, subscribe and tell me what other dark secrets you think are hidden in forgotten corners of American history, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what powerful interests worked so hard to bury. The pattern repeats throughout history with depressing regularity. Isolated communities justify elimination of the unfit. Religious authorities provide theological justification for the unjustifiable. Normal people become accomplices through gradual moral erosion and normalized incremental horror. The final haunting image is not the crimes themselves, but the single red apple continuing to grow on a gnarled branch at the contaminated reservoir's edge. Despite decades of submersion, despite poisoned soil, despite complete absence of normal agricultural conditions, that tree bears fruit with the same unnatural vitality that once made the Willard orchard famous. The land always remembers what people choose to forget.